Believe it or not, the combined cost of these 5 APS-C prime lenses comes to just £490.46 or $510.96, with the focal length spanning from an ultra-wide 6.5mm fisheye all the way to an 85mm mid-range telephoto lens. That means in theory, you could kit out your entire camera bag with these lenses for just under £500, which is pretty crazy. But the question is, are they actually any good? Well, I took them out for a spin to find out. Now, before I start tearing these lenses a new one, just a quick warning, do not expect to see any fancy features like weather sealing or even autofocus on any of these lenses. All of them are fully manual operation only and very basic in design, but I guess that's kind of to be expected for lenses this cheap. Although these lenses are designed for APS-C cameras, I don't actually own a crop sensor camera myself to test them on, so instead I just used them on my full-frame Sony A7 Mark III and simply activated the super 35mm crop mode, which essentially allows it to operate just like an APS-C camera. Okay, so starting with the longest lens in the lineup, we have the Opteka 85mm f1.8, which is priced at £139.99 or $129.99. When shooting in Super 35 mode, this gives me an equivalent focal length of 127.5mm, making it a really nice portrait lens. In terms of build, it's made from predominantly metal, the focus ring has a nice rubberized texture to it, and it rotates nice and smoothly, and also the aperture ring has a nice solid click. This lens does have a few quirks though, and although on Amazon this lens is being sold as Sony E-mount, when it arrived the lens I received was actually designed for Canon EF mount cameras. So to get around this little issue, the manufacturers have simply lumped in a cheap EF to E mount lens adapter, which was about as smooth as sandpaper going onto my camera, but in fairness it did work, so I can't really complain too much. Also included in the box was a plastic lens hood that is attached by screwing it directly onto the front element, and then the lens cap fits on the end of the lens hood rather than clipping directly onto the front element like most normal lenses. When fully constructed, this lens does kind of resemble the dick of Frankenstein's monster, though to my surprise this thing really delivered where it counts, in the bedroom. No, image quality is what I mean. Although the lens is fairly long, it wasn't impossible to capture full-length portraits, and when shooting wide open at f1.8, it creates images with a decent amount of sharpness and pleasing bokeh. Overall, I was pretty impressed with this lens. The 7 Artisans 55mm f1.4 Mark II is up next, and on Amazon this lens is priced at £104 or $126. When shooting in Super 35mm mode, this lens has an equivalent focal length of 82.5mm, and we all know that the 85mm focal length is great for portraits, so I did have a lot of hope for this lens. Made from metal, this lens is certainly the nicest looking and the best built lens of the bunch in my opinion. In particular, the gunmetal finish on the lens mount just gives this lens a really high quality finish. Both of the dials rotate nice and smoothly and have a good amount of resistance. The aperture ring is also declicked, so this might be a plus point for videographers who like to use the aperture to control exposure whilst filming. The sharpness is surprisingly good too, with my images having a nice amount of contrast straight out of the camera. Wide open at f1.4, this lens created images with lovely subject separation and surprisingly smooth bokeh. When shooting face on into the sun, you do get some hard bands of flaring across your shots, but I actually quite like the look of it, to be honest. It kind of looks like I've shot with a prism in front of my lens or something. The Neewer 35mm f1.2 is one of the cheapest lenses in our lineup, priced at just £73.49 or $84.99 on Amazon. I was quite excited by this lens as it has a super wide maximum aperture of f1.2. Plus, in Super 35mm crop mode, this lens has an equivalent focal length of 52.5mm, and I'm a big fan of 50mm lenses for portrait work because I find them to be super versatile. Made from metal, it features a declicked aperture ring and both of the dials rotate nice and smoothly. Looking at the images I captured with this lens, it definitely creates a rather unique soft and hazy look. It's almost as if you have a pro mist filter attached to the front of the lens or something, which may not be to everyone's taste, but I personally kind of like the effect it gives. Trying to manually focus at f1.2 did take a bit of trial and error, as obviously there's only a very small slither of the image that is left sharp in focus, but it's certainly not impossible. And although shooting at this super wide maximum aperture gives the images a nice thick blur, the bokeh it produces is fairly messy and not quite as nice to look at as the previous two lenses, but certainly not a terrible result. Now, if you're into lenses that look like they could have been part of the Russian space mission back in the 60s, then this TYCKA? Yeah, TYCKA 25mm f1.8 is the one for you. Priced at £59.99 or $39.99, it's also the cheapest lens in the lineup and has an equivalent focal length of 37.5mm when shooting in super 35mm mode. Despite the cheap price tag though, the construction of this lens really isn't half bad. It's all made from metal and both of the dials rotate nice and smoothly, with the manual aperture ring also being declicked. The sharpness of this lens is much better than the 35mm, but unfortunately, even when shooting wide open at f1.8, the bokeh is super messy and very textured. It does create a rather nice swirly effect at the edges of the frame, which I'm kind of into, but for bokeh fanatics, this probably isn't the one. Now, for this last lens, I will hold my hands up and admit that this Meike MK 6.5mm f2 circular fisheye is a bit of an odd choice. It's certainly not a conventional lens choice for most things, let alone portraits, but I thought, f it, let's give it a go. Priced at £112.99 or $129.99, it's one of the more expensive lenses in the group, but for this price you do get a very nicely put together lens. Made from mainly metal, the focus ring has a nice rubberized texture to it and both dials rotate smoothly. If I was being super picky, I would say that the aperture dial is very thin and quite close to the lens mount, making it a bit fiddly to operate, but otherwise no real complaints. Interestingly, with this lens being a circular fisheye, the crop factor really doesn't affect the focal length at all. In super 35mm mode, all it does is crop the image in slightly to reduce the amount of black around the edges of the frame. Needless to say, this thing is super wide, and I mean super wide. It has a 190-degree field of view, meaning that you can pack a lot into the frame. So much so that for some of the images I took, I was actually managing to capture my fingers holding the camera grip at the edges of the frame. Now, I'm not going to lie, unless you have a very specific use for this kind of look, it will probably be a lens that you use very sparingly, but it certainly creates a very unique style, and I particularly like shooting it in direct sunlight as it created this rather unique lens flare effect. So, after seeing all of these lenses, which one would you pick? Be sure to let me know in the comments section below. And whilst you're down there, why not be a total legend and click the like and subscribe buttons to make sure you don't miss out on any new videos that come to you every single Friday.